three topics I've got today: the gospel-centered church and evangelism, the gospel-centered church and discipleship, the gospel-centered church and mission. That's my three topics. So when I heard them, I said, oh, that, in other words, I could say anything I want, because they are massive topics. But what I'd like to do is, under each heading, bring up to you a couple of subtopics. You see, every one of those headings is huge: evangelism, discipleship, mission. But inside those headings, there are parts or subtopics that I think are very often not very well treated. In fact, in many cases, not treated at all. And so what I'd like to do today is under the first and under the second, take two areas, not try to give you an overview or some kind of comprehensive lecture on everything you should be doing, but take a look at two subtopics under each of those headings. The third one, I'm going to just give you one. Areas that I don't think are very often well treated that I'd like to be able to treat. And so under this topic of evangelism, I'd like to share with you over the next few minutes two subtopics. One is I'd like to talk about creating an evangelistic dynamic in your whole church. Creating an evangelistic dynamic in your whole church. And secondly, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how to communicate the gospel in a post-post society. So first of all, what do I mean by an evangelistic dynamic? Look, I'm old enough, as some of you can well see, to remember that there have been phases that we've gone through that most evangelical churches felt, I need this. I'm going to find myself, if we're going to evangelize. One phase was the crusade evangelism phase. They're in the very middle of the 20th century. So often you had mass evangelism. It wasn't just Billy Graham. There were other people who would come to town. Evangelical churches would come around them. A very intense time of training people, training volunteers, training counselors, bringing non-Christian friends to hear the gospel preached, seeing the decisions, following them up, and so on. Then there was another phase that I would say was more in the middle to late 20th century, in which the evangelism was moved forward by churches finding a small company or cadre of people inside their churches, lay people who were trained to share their faith. There was a number of different ways of doing that, of course. Some of you might remember LIFE, L-I-F-E, Lay Institute for Evangelism, was basically a way of training lay people to share their faith with the four spiritual laws. There was Evangelism Explosion, D. James Kennedy. When I read a biography of John Stott after he died, John Stott, called Godly Ambition. Very interesting book, by the way. And in the 50s and 60s, John Stott at All Souls Church in London was extremely diligent at every year finding a group of people inside his church, lay people, who he trained to do evangelism. He trained them in how to share their faith. He commissioned them publicly. These were our lay evangelists. He sent them out to do visitation in the neighborhoods. And so as a result, the second part of the 20th century, the latter part, the whole idea was the way we do evangelism is we train lay people to share their faith. There was always a pretty small percentage of people in a church, a very small percentage, but that's how we went forward. The latter generation, it's alpha and alpha courses where you invite people into a home, and it's more relational, it's more communal. Can be 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, depends. There's alpha plus alpha-like programs. Now, all of these things, actually, I would say every one of those approaches has gotten better. You can criticize any of them. I think all of them bore a lot of fruit, and any single one of them, every one of them, I think, got a bit more effective. That's another subject. I won't go there. But in every case, you could do that without actually changing the culture of your church, without creating an evangelistic dynamic in your whole church. In other words, all of those were programs that you could kind of glom on, just sort of paste onto the side of your church, where the church community itself did not have an evangelistic dynamic or focus or spirit about it. And because of that, I think all of those programs are somewhat limited in the kind of impact they can have on the community. I'd like to talk to you about what it means to actually create an evangelistic culture, a dynamic in a church. When I went to Gordon Conwell, I showed up at Gordon Conwell, it was fall 1972, so that's like 41 years ago. And I do remember that a book that was really hot, we were all reading it, it was a fairly new book, and it was really a paradigm shifter, was Michael Green's Evangelism in the Local Church. And it was simply a historic study of how evangelism happened in the early church. And it was so striking, because obviously, the first couple hundred years of Christianity saw enormous growth, tremendous evangelistic effectiveness. But I have to tell you, what Michael Green just showed was it didn't happen through any of the ways that I just mentioned. Because what I didn't realize till I read the book was obviously in many cases Christianity was always semi-underground. You couldn't go bringing your non-Christian friends to hear the great preacher, because the non-Christian friend might report you and the place be shut down. You didn't bring your non-Christian friends to hear the great preacher, nor was there any indication that the early Christians had little gospel presentations to give, or even that they were capable of long, eloquent speeches. No. It was much more pervasive, that essentially most all Christians understood that they were supposed to represent their Savior to people around them. And they were just organically, naturally, relationally engaged. They didn't have little canned presentations. They didn't take people to places necessarily. They just simply lived consistent Christian lives, and they were engaged, and they were vulnerable, and they were open. And that's how it happened. I mean, and actually that sort of thing is becoming harder and harder in our culture. There's an intimidation factor going on. I think in some ways Manhattan is a little bit of a forerunner. My guess is New England's not very far behind in this. But 25 years ago when we got to Manhattan, if you told your neighbor or somebody you were working with that you were a born-again Christian, or words to that effect, they would say, They'd be bemused, a little perplexed, maybe a little amused. Oh, really? You're kidding? That kind of thing. Today, you're going to get a lot of hostile questions. If you say the same thing 25 years later, you're going to get a lot of hostile questions. And we sense that. We sense that there's more anger and more fear of people with traditional religious beliefs. And so it's telegraphed to us, and as a result, I do think more and more we lack this evangelistic dynamic. We don't have this pervasive sense in your congregations that we are supposed to be representing Christ to our neighbors, our colleagues in very organic ways. We're supposed to identify ourselves as Christians. And we're so supposed to be vulnerable enough to talk about our Christian experience. See, we would much rather have a little cadre of Christian lay people who are the very few number of people in any church that can memorize a gospel presentation and go and memorize objections to questions and go out. We want to say, they're the lay evangelists, not me. But more and more, I think what we really need is the same kind of dynamic you had in the early church. Now, how do you create that? 3 ways. You need to present a practical theology of evangelism. You need to present a practical theology of evangelism. Secondly, you need to create a lay ministry community. And thirdly, you have to design a culture of graded inclusivity. I'll say that again and go through it, all right? First of all, you need to actually present a practical theology of evangelism. And here's what I mean by that. You have got to, at least as church leaders, and certainly as pastors or preachers, you've got to show the direct link of the gospel itself, the nature of the gospel and the logic of the gospel. You've got to show the direct link of that to being an evangelistic Christian, naturally evangelistic. You've got to show that. Here's why. Let me just give you the basic outline. I'll show you how you use this outline. The gospel eliminates pride, which is one of the main barriers to organic, natural, evangelistic contacts. Pride. It eliminates pride. You're a sinner saved by grace. It takes that out. And one of the main reasons why I think Christians are ineffective in talking about their faith is there is a pride, there's a smugness, there's an abrasiveness. There's very often a condescending behavior, and the gospel should take that away. Now, in two ways. First of all, if you're saved by grace, right? You're saved surely by grace. Then if you're a Christian and you're talking to a non-Christian, you should assume that this non-Christian might be a better person than you. So if you're a male, you're a Christian, you're talking to another male who's non-Christian, that person could easily be a better husband than you. Easily. Could easily be a better father or son or person. Why? Because you're saved by grace. You're not saved by being a better person. You're saved by grace. So here's a person who's not a Christian because they don't know Christ, but that person could easily be a more moral person than you, a wiser person than you. Why not? Because you're saved by grace, not by your wisdom and your morality. Which means there should be a deference and a respect. And that should come through, and it very often doesn't. Because frankly, a lot of Christians say they believe the gospel, but they don't think out the implications of the gospel. And the implications of the gospel is you are a sinner saved by sheer grace, and therefore that does not make you a better person than your neighbor. And of course, it just humbles you. It just reminds you, it just takes away that smugness. It reminds you that the only reason why you're a Christian is because, God helped you and things happen in this particular way. And there's nothing worse than Pharisaical evangelism, which goes like this. I'm right, you're wrong, and I love telling you about it. And that's Pharisaical evangelism. That's called subtext. Virtually nobody actually says that, though honestly on the internet I've seen it happen. I mean, when I see Christians on the internet interacting with atheists on the internet, I say, you're kidding. Why would you talk to anybody like that? You're just trying to punish the person. You're trying to persuade them. Sometimes they literally say, I'm right, you're wrong, and I love telling you about that. But certainly what happens is, unless the gospel is really sunk down into your way of thinking about things, if you talk to a non-Christian friend, there can be that kind of smugness, that kind of, well, you just don't understand, maybe. So first of all, the gospel takes away pride. Secondly, the gospel takes away fear, or it should. Fear of what? Well, if you're talking about your faith with somebody, you should be nervous. Why? You should be nervous not to offend or confuse or insult them. I get nervous when I'm talking to a non-Christian because I'm nervous that I won't be sensitive enough, or I won't be adroit enough or agile enough with my answers. I'm nervous because I don't want to, actually I want to honor the gospel that I love and believe, and I don't want to be a poor representative. That you should be nervous in those ways. But what we're usually mostly nervous about is we don't want to be disliked. We don't want people to think we're a religious fanatic. We're afraid of losing our reputation. We're afraid of disapproval. And guess what? The gospel should put you in a position where you're not as afraid of what people think, because your identity is based in who you are in Jesus Christ, not in what people think about you. The one who made himself of no reputation in order to save you. Remember, that's one old translation of Philippians 2. Jesus Christ was God, right? But he made himself of no reputation. He emptied himself of his glory in order to save us. Well, that means if I think about what Jesus did for me and the fact that he loves me, I'm loved in Jesus, and the Father loves me and he delights in me, then that you shouldn't be as afraid as we still are, of losing a reputation. So one of the reasons we do not share our faith is pride. I see people who like to share their faith, they're terrible at it because of pride. And I see other people who are afraid to share their faith because of fear. And that's because you're just not thinking out the logic of the gospel, the implications of the gospel. So the gospel takes away pride. Secondly, the gospel takes away fear. Thirdly, the gospel should take away pessimism. Now, I'm going to do this one with fear and trembling. Let me just explain. First of all, there's a tendency for us to look at people around us and say, that person would never become a Christian. Sometimes we see a really nice person, we like them, They seem so reasonable. They seem so affable. They seem so much like us. That's why we find them reasonable and affable and likable. And then we say, well, I'd love it, that person could become a Christian. There's certain people we say, I want them to become a Christian. I wish they were Christians. I feel like they could become a Christian. Then there's these people. They'll never become a Christian. Okay, so this is a type of person who would become a Christian. This is the type of person that wouldn't become a Christian. Oh, and you are? Are you the type of person who would become a Christian? What's going on here? If salvation is by grace, not by temperament, not by niceness, not by type, not by conservative versus liberal politics or things like that. If it's really by grace, then anybody can become a Christian. In fact, I have to ask, if you look at anyone and say that person would never become a Christian, if there's any kind of person you have no hope for, isn't that actually kind of a form of pride? Aren't you actually thinking, well, I'm the kind of person that, I mean, what are you? That you think that, wow, were you good material for God? Is that the reason why God was able to make a Christian out of you? It does say in Romans 3, and I quote, no one seeks for God. No one seeks for God. In fact, what I think the Bible's teaching is the nice religious people or the moral people who aren't religious, they're not really seeking for God. They're building their own self-esteem on what nice people they are. And they're actually not seeking for God. They're self-made people who worship their Creator. And then over here, these are people who are, they're sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But they're no more seeking for God or less seeking for God than the moral people. I'm sorry. Everybody's hopeless, which means we have hope for everybody. And here's what I'll say. With fear and trembling, and all due respect to people who don't differ with me on theology, one of the things I've loved about being a Presbyterian and believing that people become Christians because God opens their hearts is it takes all the pressure off of me to think, well, I better be pretty eloquent or this person better be pretty open-minded. No. Every conversion's a miracle. A miracle, which means you shouldn't be pessimistic. Ever. You should have hope for anybody. And then lastly, so the gospel takes away pride. Secondly, the gospel takes away fear. Thirdly, the gospel takes away pessimism about people. And fourthly, the gospel takes away, how do I say this, indifference. If you enjoy your salvation, if you have the joy of your salvation, and you're experiencing the love of God, how can you really be a loving friend and keep that private from the people that you know and like? I mean, obviously you can't just barge right in there and start talking to about the gospel and turning people off. You want to persuade people. But the point is, you should be, what kind of monsters are we that we can actually go through our lives and enjoy our salvation and have all kinds of people around us that we see all the time and not even ache to talk to them about it, which is nothing but a lack of love. Nothing but a lack of love. 1 Thessalonians 2, 7 and 8 says, this is where Paul is talking to the Thessalonians, he says, we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our very selves. But see, those things go together. If Jesus is giving you any kind of joy and happiness in your life, and you're a friend, it's only natural that you talk to friends about the things that are giving you joy and happiness in your life. And the only thing that would short-circuit that absolutely natural relational evangelism is fear, pessimism, or just a simple lack of love. So, now what did I just give you? I gave you a practical theology for evangelism. And here's how it works. Every so often, you need to preach the gospel. You need to teach the gospel almost exactly the way I just did it. Drawing the implication out for, this is the reason why you should be open to talking to people around you, identifying yourself as a Christian, and being at least open and vulnerable to talk about your faith. If you understand the gospel and the implications of the gospel, it just naturally turns you into a person more willing and open to talk about your faith. But at the same time, all year, if the gospel is being preached and taught in your church properly, every single week, every single day, it's being preached to knock down those four things. What are those four things? Pride, fear, pessimism or hopelessness, and joyless, loveless indifference. I mean, that doesn't mean every time you're preaching it, you're talking about evangelism. No. But if every time you're preaching it, you're after one of those four things, and you're knocking it down and you're weakening it in the hearts of the people who are hearing the gospel, then slowly, bit by bit, you're creating this practical theological basis for being just more open to be engaged with people about faith. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about you have to present a practical theology of evangelism, as it were. Plus one more thing under this heading, then we have to move on to the second, which is creating a lay ministry community. At Redeemer over the years, what we used to always talk about was this. We used to point to the beginning of Romans 15. First couple verses where it says, Christ did not please himself. Even Christ did not please himself. And so what we used to constantly say is, look, as much as we love our church for the way it meets our needs, we must not have a church that's just for us. We need to think about our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues at work who don't believe, and we need to ask ourselves, how do we structure the church? Even how do we set the church up? How do the programs go? How do we make sure that this is a church not just for us, but for people around us who don't come to church yet or who don't believe? In other words, you have to always put out there in front of people that we're a church not just for ourselves, but also for our non-Christian friends and neighbors. We're not just a church for us. We're not here just to please ourselves. And that was something we talked about constantly. That's what I mean by presenting a practical theology for evangelism, number one. Number two, secondly, you have to create a lay ministry community inside your church. Now, what do I mean by a lay ministry community? A lay minister is not the same as a lay leader. Why? A lay leader is someone who's doing a job inside the church, generally is supporting a program and not being paid for it. That's a lay leader as far as I'm concerned. A lay leader is a volunteer who's doing something that has to be done. It's something, it has to do with the program. It could be the children's ministry. It could be leading a Bible study. It could be, you got programs, and you need people, and those are, lay people are people who do them, volunteer, and they're lay leaders. But here's what lay ministry is. Lay ministry is broader than lay leadership. Let me just give you, examples of it. Let me just give you 4 examples that have more of a discipleship aspect and 4 that have more of an evangelism aspect. I just wrote these down from things that I've just seen recently around. Okay, Sally gets to know a younger woman named Clara at church. They sit together in church. Clara confides that she and her husband are having some marriage problems, but he won't go to a counselor. Sally says, Jeff and I would love to have you and Sam, Clara and Sam over for dinner. So they just come over for dinner. Turns out that Sam kind of hits it off with Jeff. Afterward, Clara convinces Sam to meet with Jeff and Sally and talk a bit about marital adjustment. And after one of those meetings goes pretty well, they say, let's read a book on marriage together. And they read it and they meet together 2 or 3 times. What is that? That's lay ministry. Let me give you another one. I won't give you, I had 8 here. I'm not going to give you 8. But anyway, here's one. Jessica meets Teresa, a new believer at church, invites her to work through a set of 6 Bible studies for newer Christians on issues like prayer, Bible reading, and the role of the church, understanding the gospel better. In other words, Jessica meets Teresa. Jessica remembers that when she was a younger Christian, she was in a group that went through a series of 6 studies. She meets Teresa, who's a new believer, seems to be struggling in some areas. Jessica says, well, here, look, why don't you go through these things and read them? They helped me when I was newer in the faith. And we'll meet 2 or 3 times together and talk about it, okay? Here's another one. Now, that's more than discipleship. On the other side, Jerry is asked by his work colleague, Bill, how his weekend went. Jerry responds that he went to a men's retreat and they talked about forgiveness and that it really helped him. And Bill says, really? And then Jerry swallows because Bill was kind of saying, I'd like to hear more about that. Maybe Bill's got a problem forgiving somebody. And so Jerry says, well, yeah, it has a lot to do with the Christian faith. It goes on another minute or so, and Bill says, oh, really? And Jerry just files it and says, maybe in a month or so I'll ask Bill to something. See, this is lay ministry. Here, let me give you one more. John comes to church with his wife, but isn't sure what he believes or where he stands on faith. The pastor introduces him to another person named Tom, who begins to meet with John intermittently just to read a book on basic Christianity and discuss it. Now, here's what I want you to see. This is organic. That is, it's happening outside of programs. Secondly, it's relational. It's based on informal or non-formal relationships, not formal relationships. Thirdly, it's word-oriented. That means the lay minister has just enough confidence about what they understand about the Bible and Christianity to feel like I'm willing to talk to somebody and answer questions and have them read a book and talk about it. So it's organic, it's relational, it's word-oriented, and it's active. That is to say, you're taking initiative. You're not being too coercive. You're not going too strong. Now, lay ministry, you need to have, if possible, 20 to 25% of the people in your church who are lay ministers, whether or not they're lay leaders. You hear me? And so your goal as a pastor or as a church leader is to say, how can I have 20 or 25% of my people who have the vision for this, have models for this, are getting encouraged by the leaders to do this? So that listen, this is the tide that raises all the boats. This is out beyond the programs. And this means if you can develop a community of people who think of themselves as lay ministers and do lay ministry, now you're getting closer to the evangelistic dynamic that permeates the church. Look, even in the early church, not all Christians were equally adept evangelists. They couldn't be. My experience in the past, my church did Evangelism Explosion when I had a church in Virginia, and we trained people, and we saw people become Christians. You trained people for a number of weeks. You took them out and you visited people. You followed up people who came to church and so forth. But the percentage of people in your church who can be trained to do that is tiny. And though I built in a lot to those people, lay ministry is something, it's much broader, and I think it's closer to what you have in early Christianity. You're not giving people just, here's what you say to people. You're simply trying to build up their confidence to reach out to people in an informal way, out beyond the programs, and just be more active and be more willing to bring the Word of God and the gospel into connection with people's lives. Now, how do you create that lay ministry community? Well, here's what I suggest. One of the things to do is to invite your lay leaders to a regular meeting with the pastor or pastors. We did this every month, and we called it a ministry community meeting. Every month is a lot. A lot of people do it every other month. Some people do it quarterly. But what you do is, first of all, how do you get something like this started? You have to do it with some formality. So you say, we want to get all the lay leaders together, and so you have a list of the people. They should be pretty much all your volunteers, and you bring them in. But then you also personally invite people that you know have that kind of lay ministry potential, or even maybe they're already doing it, but they're not actually inside the programs of your church. You got to get them in there too. And so if you have a church of 200 people, I would hope that you'd have 20 to 40 of those, 20 to 40 people meeting. If you have a church of 150, like I said, think about 20, 25, 30%. And what you're doing there is you say, well, do you train them? No. You teach them. And you give them, you make them feel much closer to the pastor. You might do an exposition of the Gospel of John for 2 or 3 times, or you might do some teaching on evangelism, or you might get them to think more about their prayer life and their walk with God. It's basically, you might say, well, it's just discipleship. Yeah, I guess. But the main thing is, you as a pastor, right now I'm going to talk to pastors, you as a pastor have to have 25% of your people or so who are in a closer connection to you, and you are giving them a vision for lay ministry, you're talking to them about it, you're giving them examples, and you're also giving them support. So if they get into a conversation, they can get you on the phone and say, so-and-so, I talked to them and they asked me this question about evil and suffering. What do I give them to read? There's a sense in which you're sort of, creating, yes, a bit of a set of Marines inside your church. People who are a little more confident because they've gotten a little more from you as the pastor. They feel like you're behind them, they feel affirmed by you, they've gotten a little more training, and you're really saying, giving them the vision to just reach out and start meeting with people and talking to people. In particular, though, let me suggest this. You have to get them to reflect on whether they have two-way relational integrity and whether they have a consistent Christian life. Now, here's what I mean by two-way relational integrity. There are some Christians who I consider bubble Christians. That is, they have almost all their friendships inside the church. They live in the community, they work in the community, but basically all of their hangout people, the people they hang out with, it's all inside the church. So they're in the bubble. There are other people who are extremely well networked in the community at large, and they're private about their faith. I mean, they know everybody, they're community leaders, they're involved, everybody knows them, they're involved with everybody, and yet they're very private about their faith. Private people who are well networked, bubble people who are maybe open about their faith, but they don't really have close connections to anybody except other Christians. Neither of those, I would say, they don't have two-way relational integrity. In other words, the relationships aren't integrated. The private person is not integrating his or her faith with the relationships out there. They're not identifying enough as Christians to the people out there. The bubble people also are not integrated. They're not really in the world. You're supposed to be in the world but not of the world. They're not really in the world. They're in the church. And therefore, what you really want is two-way integrity. And what you say to people is, if you tend to be out there and private or public and bubbled, you need to start taking steps to changing that. And what you always have to say is, it doesn't mean you have to share your faith or you have to give a testimony. It just means let people know you went to church. Like that one guy I talked about. Just here, for example, you go to a men's retreat. It's a great retreat. You learn about forgiveness. You go to work on Monday. A friend at work asks, "How was your weekend?" Do you tell him you went on a church retreat? Do you tell him you learned about forgiveness? Do you tell him it actually helped you forgive your mother-in-law? And because what that does is it's being honest about the fact. If this guy's your friend, or sort of friendly to him, why not let him know something that gives you help? But if you don't say anything like that, because, oh my gosh, I don't want to sound like a religious fanatic, you have cut the nerve of relational integrity. You are refusing to integrate your faith with your relationship. You're refusing just to be honest like everybody else is. I mean, listen, we live in a society right now that basically encourages you to share everything publicly. And tells you over and over again, you've got to let people know who you are. You've got to be public about who you are. You've got to be private about who you are, unless you're a Christian. You need to keep that private, because religion is for private. Do you see the complete hypocrisy there? The reality is in the middle. The reality is you shouldn't be always trying to talk about yourself, but the reality is you shouldn't be private. You shouldn't be bubbled, and you shouldn't be private. And your lay ministry community, you hammer that. You talk about relational integrity, two-way. You bring up what they should be doing. Now, people who are doing it well, you celebrate. And that lay ministry community is a way of really creating a kind of evangelistic dynamic, an evangelistic spirit in the very heart of your church that is not just a little cadre of people or a little program that's placed there, but really gives you an outward-faced church. Now, lastly, I said, I used a big term. I'm going to be real brief on this, but I have to. You need to eventually build a culture of graded inclusivity. And what I mean by that is now we are talking about events or programs or groups. But I think that the wisest way to if you're stressing not training people in how to share their faith in a particular way. I don't do that. I have never done that. I wouldn't know what to choose. I wouldn't know what gospel presentation to choose. Never have. But if you're not stressing training people and giving them a little thing to say, but you're really trying to just say relational integrity, consistent Christian life, getting rid of your fear, your pride, your pessimism, just being more vulnerable and being a better friend. Don't do friendship evangelism, just do friendship and don't hide. Don't do friendship evangelism, just do friendship and don't hide who you are. If you're doing that, and I think you should, then you shouldn't have one or two evangelistic event programs. Instead, you should have a gradation of kinds of events and things that you do that are more and more, at one level, it takes almost there's actually no confrontation at all with the gospel. And at the very end, there's a strong confrontation. Let me give you an example. Let me see. Okay. A level would be any kind of meeting or event in which the non-Christian gets to know Christians, but there's actually no presentation of Christianity at all. So, for example, a service project. If your church is rehabbing a house in a poor part of town, invite non-Christians to come be part of that, but there's no presentation of Christianity. You're just asking them to come. Anything that is basically it's a project or a social setting in which the non-Christians get to meet a lot of Christians, but there's no presentation of Christian truth at all. That's A level. B level is something of broad interest that basically sheds a positive light on Christianity. Sheds a positive light on Christianity. So now, here's where every town is going to be different and your culture is going to be different. And I'm afraid to give you any examples from Manhattan because Manhattan is such a strange place. And we all know. But see, for example, if you, let me just give you 4 or 5 and you begin to get the hint, even though you say, well, that would never work for weekend. But so, for example, if you had a concert, like I'll give you an example. What if you did a Bach concert? That's what we did. And you just had a chamber orchestra and great singing. And then there was a talk on some of the meaning, like we did Bach's Wedding Cantata. Brilliant, beautiful, lovely piece. It's just like with a concert. But it's filled with Christian truth. So then you get up and you give a lecture, and here's what Bach thought about Christianity and how it affected his view of marriage. And that's the reason why you have these words here, and you get the words up on the screen. You could do that before or after the concert. So what you have is you're just putting Christianity in a good light. But at the other end of the spectrum, you could have a jazz concert, and you have some jazz, famous, well-known jazz musician, and all the jazz people in town come out, and that jazz person at some point says something positive about his or her Christian faith if they have it. It could be, on the other hand, you could have an artist who actually does a gallery showing but talks about faith, because, you know, it's really interesting. When artists are showing their art, they can talk, they can say anything. Because they say, this is what I'm trying to get, and this is who, and there's just, and this means this, and this is this, and here we have that, and you know, no. And it all comes from my Christian faith. And everybody goes, oh. I'm not making fun at all. I'm trying to say that if you can have a lecture on the history of your town, and if it's in New England, there's got to be Christianity in there. So have some person who comes in and does a lecture on the history of the town. Obviously, if you've got a historic church building, there's no reason at all why you could not find ways of being more public about that and bring people in and having events that talk about the church and gather people, and we've been here for 300 years, and this is what there are a zillion ways of finding events that you do in which, if they're of broad interest, people would come to hear the lecture or hear the concert or see it, and Christianity is just presented in a positive way. You're not confronting people with Christian truth. That's B level. I got a lot more I could tell you, but there we go. C level is where you have affinity. Christians and non-Christians get together because they they're business people, or because they're media people, or because they're mothers of young people, of children, where there's some kind of affinity where Christians and non-Christians get together and you talk about something of joint interest. That's the reason why very easy for 3 or 4 young mothers of preschoolers who are Christians to form some kind of group where they're talking about anything that has to do with child rearing or child nourishment or child discipline or whatever, and you bring other people together and have a speaker come in and you have a discussion. And again, it's another situation in which Christianity is very often being presented in a positive way, but in that sense you have it's more narrow, more affinity. I was shocked. I was invited to go speak, and obviously I was translated because I can't speak Spanish, but I was in Buenos Aires. I was asked to speak to a group of businessmen, something like 200 businessmen in Buenos Aires, about how do you deal with stress. The fact is that Latin America is catching up to the rest of the world right now, especially Buenos Aires, and work is more stressed. The hours are longer. There's more pressure to produce profits. The culture is changing. A lot of people are experiencing stress. So I was asked to come in, and I spent about half the time on the talk talking about the problems of stress and what that does to your insides, etc. And then at a certain point I said, I'm a Christian minister, as you know, and I'm a Protestant minister. Most of the people either were non-Christians or they were Catholics. And I said, here's some resources that for the Protestant understanding of the Christian faith and the gospel that really help with stress. And you could have heard a penny drop for the last 10 minutes of that talk. And a lot of people came out and said to me, I've never heard anything like this. And so that was an affinity situation. We brought people together. It could be a book club. That's an affinity thing. People love to read books, so read Flannery O'Connor and talk about the Christian faith beneath it will come out, and so on. So that's level C. Level D, when you get to level D, you're actually doing a small group or a meeting in which Christianity is being discussed. So we have things called Uncorked, Christianity Uncorked, which is at a pub. So some of you Baptists won't do that. And or you can have a meeting in somebody's home, and it's very simple. It's no more than 20 people, so there's lots of interaction, and you bring a non-Christian friend that through one of these other things that you've done, you see a little bit of interest, and you say the subject's going to be, why does God allow so much evil and suffering in the world? Or does religion inevitably lead to division and war? Or do all religions basically worship the same God? And you bring a non-Christian friend and you have a speaker very often. And because it's a small group, you don't have to have this great orator, you know. Anybody can do it, I think, who's got something of a little bit of background, maybe a little bit of training, okay? You could have a seminary student do it. You could have a pastor, of course, could do it. It could be a lay leader in the church could do it. And that's what I would call level D. Level E would be a group in which you really are people who are very interested in Christianity are coming and studying a book. Now we're down to Alpha. Now we're down to Christianity Explored. Now we're down to reading a book, and people who are really trying to think about Christianity come in and they're being presented Christianity week after week after week. That's, I call E level. F level is a traditional situation in which people are brought in to a breakfast, to a meeting like this. A person preaches the gospel and calls for a decision. I think even small churches should have all the levels every year. Stuff happening. So that your lay ministers can bring people in at whatever level they're finding interest, or even bring them up, you know, from level to level to level. And so those are the three things. Got it? That is, you have to present a practical theology of evangelism, you have to create a lay ministry community, and you have to create a culture of graded inclusivity. And I know that sounded messy, isn't it? You know, no bullet points, you know, no DVD, no curriculum to work through, no action steps. Honestly, it is more organic than that, it's more relational than that, and actually it's more spiritual than that could be. And yet, I think this is what we need. I think we need that more than another program. So, now I promised, even though I have 5 minutes left, to talk to you about a second subject, and I will, briefly. Up to now, I've said nothing about what you actually say. In fact, I've given you the impression that I don't like gospel presentations. That's not true. I like gospel presentations. I just don't like giving your lay people the impression that if you memorize this particular gospel presentation, you can evangelize. I think what that does is it gives many people an excuse not to do it. And also, I don't know of any gospel presentation that fits everybody. When I was in London, I realized that I was talking to evangelical Christians in London, and I realized that half the non-Christian neighbors are Hindus and Muslims who think Christianity is too morally weak. It's not moral enough. You know, it's too much of this grace and forgiveness. It's not moral enough. And the other people their other neighbors are secular white people who think Christianity is too moral, too narrow, too legalistic. So give me a gospel presentation that will work both for your Muslim neighbor and your sex, drugs, and rock and roll neighbor. I don't know that there is one. Having said that, I think it's very important for you to all consider one of Pascal's pensées. Pascal has a pensée that those are these little, almost like proverbs. They were actually, Pascal died before he could write this great book on apologetics for the Christian faith. But one of the things that he did say there was this. All I have to do is find it quickly. He said, "Make good men wish Christianity to be true, and then prove it so." Make good men wish Christianity to be true, then prove it so. And I think there's a tendency for us still to be locked into apologetics that were written 50 years ago. Apologetics 50 years ago existed in a situation in which most people respected Christianity, but increasingly smart people would go off to college, they'd go off to school, they would get the intellectual props knocked out from under them, and they would come back with a lot of doubts. They'd come back to churches and they'd say, well, what about how can you prove there even is a God? And aren't there a lot of contradictions in the Bible? And what about evil and suffering? And what about the other religions? Aren't they ways to God too? And they would have these all these objections, and sometimes people answered them, sometimes they didn't. But most apologetics books, still, including mine, I wrote a book called The Reason for God. Most apologetics books are basically saying, here's how Christianity makes intellectual sense. Evidence for the resurrection, clues for the existence of God, answers to problems of faith and science, answers to questions about whether the Bible is historically reliable. See, here's why Christianity makes intellectual sense. And 50 years ago, people respected Christianity enough that if they actually heard somebody say, I can show you that Christianity makes intellectual sense, they would sit and listen. Those days are over. And Pascal seemed to understand that, being the brilliant philosopher he was. He looked and he said, before you can prove it's true, you need to make them wish it were true. The last thing I want to say to you is, I don't think we're very good at that. Because that, to a great degree, that means before we start to say, here's why Christianity is true, we've got to present Christianity in such an amazing garb. We have to expose it. We have to reveal it. We have to lift it up. So it's so beautiful that the average person who's not utterly bitter, and there are people who are just cannot be reached because they're so bitter, the average person would say, wow, wouldn't it be great if that were true? But it's not. See, that's where nobody's going to read, I think, Reason for God or Evidence That Demands a Verdict or any of the apologetics books anymore, including mine, unless the person first says, wouldn't it be great if that were true? But it's not. Then they'll listen to a book. But do we know how to get people there? I don't think so. Let me just give you one example that I would call apologetics, and then I'm done. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote a very famous essay called On Fairy Stories. On Fairy Stories. And in it he points out, well, he's trying to explain something. He's trying to explain why is it that we find that even in our scientific age we still love fantasy. Why do movies and books that are basically fairy tales, why is there such an amazing hunger for it and appetite for it? Why do we love talking about dragons and witches and sorcery, and why? It's astounding. Why didn't we just say that's just kid stuff? But it's not kid stuff. And here's what he says. He says, there are certain things that human beings long for. We long to step outside of time. We long to escape death. We long for love that never ends. We long for triumph over evil, and we also long to communicate with non-human beings. And any story that gives us that, escaping death, escaping out of time, love without parting, triumph over evil, holding communication with non-human beings, any story that we, any really good story, well-told story, vivid story that gives us that, we love. Why do we love it? Because we long for that. And even though we know it's a fairy tale, even though we know it's fiction, it is incredibly satisfying. Now Tolkien says, why? He says Christianity explains something. Christianity explains that we know we were made for that. That's why we're so fascinated with fairy tales. We were made to talk with angels. We were made not to die. We were made for love without parting. We were made for all those things. And that's a memory trace in us. But do you realize that if Jesus Christ is who he said he is, that's all going to come true? Now you got to look at people and say, do you realize that if Jesus Christ is who he said he is, that's all going to come true? Why wouldn't you want that to be true? You don't sit there in your pew and tell me, oh, I don't care whether that's true or not. Of course you care whether that's true. Wouldn't it be great if it was true? Well, it is. Do we know how to do that? Do we know how to do what Pascal said? Make it so that good people, which it means by that, normal people, open people, not utterly bitter people, not people that are just so closed, but the average person can be shown Christianity in such a way that they wish it were true. Then you can prove it to be true. And I think that is extremely important for us to do as a church, and we're not very good at it. Now, right now, I'm going to close this in prayer for a minute because I want to pray that something I said might be of help to you, okay? Seriously. And then we're going to keep going. Let me pray. Our Father, we do thank you that you have called us to be your witnesses in the world. You don't need to do that. You certainly could just call people to yourself. You could write the gospel in fiery letters across the sky. There's all sorts of ways you could do it, but you have chosen to proclaim your gospel through us. We thank you for that. We thank you for the joy of that. We thank you for the honor of that, and we pray that you would equip us to do what you've called us to do. And perhaps, Father, equip us a little better because of the time we've just spent. Continue to be with us during this day. Equip us, build us up, stir us up to love and good works. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.